Barrie, so I went to Barrytown School, went to Spalding High School. Always was very mystified by U32. The rumor was you had a smoking lounge for the kids back then, but I just couldn't understand that. None of us could in Barrie, so we probably had a higher rate of smoking there, I would bet. You go to the next slide. This is where I work. I work for, I won't spend a lot of time on all this, I can tell you later. I want to get to the actual details because for the first time I'm actually talking to people who may know more about this material than me. I don't have to tell like the story of the land and where everything is. You'll be able to tell me. And I wish I had been able to give this 2 years ago when I was really doing my research so that all of these details would be super fresh. I still have a lot of it, but when it comes to like where certain things are, you might be saying, you don't get it, it's on the other side of Cape Farm or whatever it may be. So anyway, we are an Indigenous run theological graduate school, PhD and 4 master's degrees. 7 of our 8 founders are Indigenous. There's people like me, a couple of us who are not, who work and help foster this vision. I can talk about that later if you want. Go ahead to the next one. This is where my main research has been with Nicholas Black Elk. Black Elk Speaks. Andy and I connected on this book. A lot of you have probably read it. One of the most important and influential books about a Native American holy person. So we can talk about that too if you want later. But I do all this work, I can go to the next slide, with Indigenous people and Indigenous traditions. And you know what? It finally woke up. We had lived in the Navajo reservation for 5 years, and I came back home. This was 2017, and I said, you know what is my community's history? Now I knew the basic Vermont story. Like by the 90s, when I was in high school, we had, all right, Abenakis were here. This was Abenaki territory, but we fought like mostly in Lake Champlain or down near Brattleboro, right? Those were the main homelands, or Newberry. What about Montpelier or Barrie? I had never heard a single thing ever about the Indigenous history here. And did you all? I mean, Andy, I know you did. Your mother did this research. Was it common knowledge, the history of East Montpelier? No. Because this was a hotbed, and you'll see some of the details. And your publication talks about it. So there's
across the onion.
Across the onion. Yeah. That valuable resource. You can go, and in fact, right over here, like a couple hundred yards, or maybe it's more like a quarter of a mile, was a really important. There was a fortress there that the first settlers found. Different artifacts, but we'll talk about that in a little bit. So let's go to the next slide.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, you go to the next slide. This is for people who don't know where I live.
So I'm just supposed to put a plug in for the book.
Yeah.
We do have lots of copies available of the hardcover and maybe Teresa softcover and softcover, and they're gonna go on a holiday sale fairly soon. So if you have interest in getting Across the Onion for either yourself, your household, or for somebody in your family, watch, I think, Front Porch Forum, and I'll post something about it.
Do you give one to your speakers?
I don't have one in my back pocket, but we can arrange it. Yes, Damien would be happy
Excellent.
to do it.
Okay, next slide, please. You probably, as good historians, have consulted this resource numerous times. Interesting thing, mid-1800s, there was this real movement of women who did a lot of literary and scholarly work in Vermont. But we'll talk about that later. Go ahead, next slide. I found the part about Montpelier, and there's 3 whole pages of the native history here in the Gazetteer. And then I came to this, which I had never heard before. The story of Jacob Fowler, who is considered to be the first settler here, and this fight that he has that ends up with an Indian being killed or dying. Had you heard this story before? Anybody? Andy hadn't, so you're the only one?
Well, no, I've read that in the child's directory.
So we've read it, but it's not common knowledge, right?
No.
Nobody talks about it, nobody, which is an interesting dynamic. It's gonna be one of our research questions. which will help us think about, did this actually happen? Did it happen in this way? Is this more of a literary creation? But anyway, long story short, Jacob Fowler used to come here before there was no towns. He used to hunt and trap. Very shady character, we'll talk about him. The story goes is he came out here, Sodom Pond Brook, and found an Indian raiding his traps. And just look at the beauty of this passive language. The situation resolved into a case of the death of one of the parties. Who and how did this person die? You read that sentence, you have no idea. But an interesting clue to how our community is trying to process this story. Fowler was the victor. All right, next slide. Well, who is this Jacob Fowler guy? This is not Jacob Fowler. It's a Remington image, but that captured how I imagined him. And he had a dog, Jowler, who we'll hear about. That's very important in Central Vermont history. But he was the first one, even though there was a French Canadian and his wife before them, but before him. He was a hunter and trapper, and he was considered to be an Indian scout for various military bodies. That's another open question. Go ahead. Next slide. Who is the Indian? Probably Western Abenaki or Abenaki. But as I've been doing my research, I think it's a growing but small chance it was a Mohawk. From Ganawage, which is the Indian Reserve across from Montreal. This was important territory for the Mohawk as well, but we'll talk about that. And this is the view of Sodom Pond Brook where the murder would have occurred. It's actually on this side of the road. And you forgive me, I don't know all the road names.
Adamant Road.
Adamant Road?
Yeah, that's Adamant Road, and then
So I think this would be,
Sodom Pond Road.
this would not be it does go all the way.
It looks like Snow Hill Road.
Copy
And
that.
down towards
It's
that
hard to
garden.
tell where that is.
Across the onion has the exact address where this occurred. Next slide, I'll show you exactly where it
Oh,
was.
good.
Okay.
This is the spot where across the onion gives this incident. So you come down a hill, I think there's a big farm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's Snow Hill.
Snow Hill, yeah.
Bottom
Yeah,
Snow
Snow
Hill.
Hill, and then the brook crosses under it and comes down this way and comes down Kelton Road,
Yes,
and I don't know where it goes from there.
okay, but you've got it. Next slide. All right, the other confusing part of the story, aside from the passive language and imprecise nature of it, Mr. Fowler eventually went to Canada. It is said where he spent the last years of his life and where he died at an advanced age. So part of the story is that Fowler disappears too, and relatively soon after this happens. I think it was like maybe 10 years that he disappears off of our radar here in Central Vermont. So a lot of my work is trying to figure out, where did he go? Did he go to Canada or somewhere else? Next slide. Okay, questions that I had. Where did this Indian come from? I had been told mostly, well, we don't really have Indians. Okay, now we kind of know that there were, but where? Which community? Which tribal group? Yes.
What time frame are we talking about? Did
Oh,
you
I'm sorry,
mention
that
that
was
already?
1791.
1791.
I believe that's the
Okay.
date that they said the murder occurred.
Okay.
Possible murder. All right, is this legendary? We settler communities, particularly in New England, have this propensity to inventing the last Indian. And you can think of, like when I was a kid, The Last of the Mohicans, right? The Daniel Day-Lewis, Russell Means movie about the last Mohican person who gets killed dramatically at the end, or his son does, and there's one left, the sad chief. Well, actually the Mohicans, they're still a tribe. They live in Wisconsin. They were removed from western Massachusetts, Stockbridge, where my grandparents were from. And they actually granted, if I remember the history correctly, is it Plainfield or Marshfield was from a grant from the Stockbridge tribe. They had been given lands in compensation for their participation in the Revolutionary War, and so the charter of Marshfield comes
Yeah, it's
from
Marshfield.
the Mohicans. Yeah.
I was just gonna say that they left Stockbridge and then settled in Stockbridge, Wisconsin.
Yes, exactly. And as we know, they're still there. And if you go to Stockbridge, Mass today, and all those beautiful colonial houses that you see, this is like a very important sort of Manhattan retreat area. We have the documents of which tribal member lived in which house. Those were the native houses.
Okay.
Why did they grant them land in Plainfield if they wanted to?
This was before, this was land that nobody really wanted at the time it was granted. And, well, we gotta pay the Indians something, so they could have that, and they said, well, this is a trading commodity because we can't really anyway. Very convoluted. All right, so this is where the three parts we're gonna do tonight, tracking Jacob Fowler, tracking the Indian, and then my current best theory, because I'm hoping you'll help me move this forward some more. Go ahead. One more time.
Yep.
All right, one of the biggest troubles in my sort of amateur research was that there's a lot of Jacob Fowlers out there.
You bet, like 4 generations or something.
Yes, exactly. In his case, at least 3. But then there's other ancillary Jacob Fowlers. There's one from a different line that ended up in Northfield a few decades after this Jacob Fowler in Berlin. But he was the youngest of 5, the only boy, and they originally came from the Salisbury, Mass area via Rockingham, New Hampshire, and then ended up in Newbury, which was the largest and most important community in the river region of sort of the upper valley at the time. And that's in part because it was the most important native settlement historically.
Excuse me?
Yes.
The date, 1860.
1760?
I thought we were talking about.
I'm sorry, it should be 1760. I gotta fix that. Thank you for pointing that out.
I can't erase it from here.
His father was a very prominent figure, Captain Fowler. Go ahead, maybe I have some on the next slide, I don't remember. Yes. And part of this story is that the Fowlers were accused of, and I think very accurately, of being loyalists. And his father, not as much. I think he had Tory sympathies. He was wrapped up in this plot, so there was 4 of them that were arrested in 1776 in Newbury, and only one of them was kept. One of them was, I think, convicted. He was released, but he never escaped that label of being Tory. And eventually, they were sort of run out of town. And another little layer to this is that the plot that was uncovered here was disclosed or reported by an Indian. You know, the natives were always shifting their alliances around. They were, of course, very well connected. That's something we don't appreciate. We'll talk more about that. But they knew all the people in the area and both sides, and knew how to play both sides. And the natives mostly sided with the British in the Revolutionary War. Almost everyone in northern New England and in Canada. So Jacob III, which is one we're talking about, who ends up here, is said to have fought for the British at the Battle of Bennington. Now, during this time period, before and then after, he's always like off in the wilderness, which is here at the time, and elsewhere, and nobody really knows what he's doing. He's a trapper, an outdoors person, a scout, but a lot of the times he's with other people that the people back at home don't know about, and people are pretty sure that he was with the British at the Battle of Bennington. Go ahead. And in fact, I'll say that. Royalton Raid, are you all familiar with this?
Yes.
Okay, a very brief overview. 1780, towards the end of the Revolutionary War, a group of 300 Mohawk, Abenaki, and then British were looking to sack Newbury, because that was the most important military target in northern New England. Newbury was alerted to their presence, and so they diverted and went off and sacked Royalton. You know, so you drive down 89, and you look over the ridge there. That was the last major Indian raid of our history here, and when captives were taken back up to Canada. Now, Jacob Fowler, according to the history, met them at the Forks of the Winooski. So, right in Montpelier, when it was not Montpelier, and told them that they had been, that Newbury was waiting for them. They knew. And so the reason why they went to Royalton as opposed to continuing to Newbury, which would have been more problematic, was because Jacob warned them. Now, I don't know if this is true. The history says this, and in fact, there was a play I found in a newspaper article in like the 30s that memorialized Jacob's role in sort of warning the British troops about this and leading them to sack Royalton. Go ahead. So in 1779, he moves to Corinth, which is go to the next slide. One more. Go one more. So the settlement of Vermont is, you don't have to go very far to see a very dramatic difference in the time we're talking about here. Where we are in the central region, northern mountains region, and then the Northeast Kingdom, was settled much later by Europeans and by Americans than almost everywhere else south of us. Over here, there's settlement like 50 years before us. The Revolutionary War, first the French and Indian War, but then the Revolutionary War kept enough pressure on would-be settlers that they didn't risk coming this far north. It was too dangerous. This was still firmly in control of, if not settled by, native people. And so the settlement, even though Newbury was here during the Revolutionary War, didn't penetrate the mountains at all. And so as they began their settlement, they came up from this direction. So go backwards one. So that's where Jacob Fowler goes. He stays there only for a couple of years, but he continues his activity here in central Vermont. And spent most of the time hunting and trapping. This is what I was telling you about, Andy, the letter from Colonel Thomas Johnson to George Washington, I believe, that William Taplin and Jacob Fowler are roaming around central Vermont, and we don't really know what their intentions are. With Jacob Fowler, there's always this air of suspicion and uncertainty and danger. Go ahead. Two slides.
Before you go beyond that,
Yes.
can you read the dates on that map? The
on
dates are
this
too small,
one?
yeah, the dates are too small for us to read.
Yes. This is after 1791. That's fitting. So up here, I can't really read it that well.
It's like 84.
1784 to 1799.
77.
But even that's a little misleading, because a lot of times they're giving the charter date. Like you go to Moortown and they say chartered in 1765 or whatever it is. And no, there was nobody that was chartered then, but nobody settled it until the late 1780s or 1790s. So charters is just when New York and New Hampshire figured out their dispute over who was going to have control over Vermont, and they divvied up the right to claim the land, but it didn't get occupied in a lot of cases. One more. Okay, so he settles in central Vermont, and every time you go over 89, you're going right by his tract. So I always try to find exactly where it is, and it's hard to tell. But you know where Dog River recreational field is? Like my son plays soccer there. If you follow the river a little bit further south, it's on the other side, from what I can tell. And so it's now controlled by railroad. The railroad, that was his tract. He built his solitary log hut where the railroad now runs some 60 rods south of the junction of the road with Montpelier Branch. And the remains of the hut were visible until removed in the building of the railroad about 20 years ago, and so this was the Argus and Patriot writing in 1865. Go ahead. I don't know if I have time to tell this whole story, but if you go to Elm Street in Montpelier, where that cemetery is, which is the oldest existing cemetery, there was another one that was older in the meadows that was actually built on top of a native burial ground. That's what the history says. That was relocated to Green Mountain Cemetery in 1865. Fowler tells this story, maybe I'll tell it, that D.P. Thompson records, important sort of rabbit trail there you have to pursue, of being on the river, and one day he was just doing his hunting thing, and he heard this crashing noise, and out of the bush comes this big black bear. And that bear paid him no attention, jumped into the water and onto a sandbar, a sand island, and digged like a little hole, dug a hole. And laid on his back, put its hands and its feet up with his claws out, and out of the bush comes rushing this big catamount, a mountain lion, which leapt onto the bear who was prepared, and the bear disemboweled the mountain lion. Now Jacob Fowler, according to everybody who knew him, was full of these stories. And they didn't know if they could believe him. And so D.P. Thompson, if you go to the next slide, I think I have something. That's a quote summarizing his own character, but D.P. Thompson says, I didn't know what to believe either. He had interviewed all the old timers as part of his history. He said, but I came to the conclusion that I think that one was accurate. This is again, the Argus and Patriot, 1867. Fowler was rather a peculiar man, seemed to avoid rather than court the acquaintance of the settlers who believed there was some mystery hanging over his former life, which he was not inclined to disclose. Now, most people think it's a Tory thing, but I think it could be the stated thing too, maybe even more so. Next slide. Again, the Argus and Patriot, they're writing a lot about Jacob Fowler. 1865, and they say he went to Canada because he had been run out because he was a Tory. I should also say to look for less disturbed hunting ground, they say. That is a characteristic of him. He's always on the edge of the frontier. He wants to stay ahead of it. Go ahead, next slide. This is part of the paper trail. He sells his farm in 1793 to Jacob Davis, which seems to indicate this moving on, like is reported in the history. What's interesting, there isn't a record of his getting the land, like the other people.
But that says Jacob Fowler, blah, 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 Jacob Davis, Esquire, on certain date, 1793.
So that's in Berlin?
That's in
farm?
Berlin,
Okay.
that spot we talked about on
Yeah.
the confluence. Go ahead. All right, now this is where 2 years, this is sort of hazy, but my general conclusion from all these different documents that I was able to pull together, he appears on multiple censuses, at the same time. So in Berlin and Newbury in both 1790 and 1800. His family was still there, and so he was probably going back and forth. He's married, he has kids in Berlin at this time. He's paid a wolf bounty, the wolf bounty situation here. Last wolves were shot in the Irish Hill, which is between Northfield and Berlin, and he was part of wiping them out. You were paid, I think, $20 back then, which is a lot of money. He seems he was a mail carrier from Newbury to Danville around 1800, and I think he ended up moving to Orange, where his daughter marries this person named Joshua Chase. I don't know if this is, I have to go back and look at this again, but I think I discovered he got a Revolutionary War pension in 1818, which would be remarkable, given that he didn't seem to fight on the American side. And my best guess is that he follows them to Johnson, Vermont, where he dies in 1825.
Meaning his daughter follows.
Yes, and Joshua Chase, who then they later moved to Illinois. But interesting question. He was able to escape in plain sight to Johnson. I mean, this is a different world. We don't have the same level of communication, but people were surprisingly mobile back then. Fowler was moving all over the place all the time. And so
Escaped from what? You say he escaped there, but escaped from what?
well, from public perception.
Oh, I see, I mean,
Like, we don't, the history doesn't say he moved to Johnson. It says he moved to Canada.
right.
So if this is accurate, which it may not be, did he do this intentionally? How did he pull that off? How did the story remain that he went to Canada? Go ahead. All right, next part. This is just the reiterating the fur fight. Go ahead. Probably most of you have a very good understanding of this now. This is the traditional Abenaki homelands here. This would be Newberry, Calais. Here we are here. Go ahead. And it's likely that if there was Indian here, they would have been most directly connected to Odanak, which is near Trois-Rivières, straight north in Quebec.
Do you want me to go back to the map?
Yeah, I want you to go back so people can see where it is. It's also called St. Francis. So here's Montreal, you go up the St. Lawrence River. It's like halfway between Montreal and Quebec City. And so the general pattern was, at this time, people would spend at least part of the year in the mission village. This was a Catholic mission, and would come back for their traditional hunting practices, often during the winter. You know, people are going back and forth, trading down south, or, as we saw, for military reasons. Another very important community was Ganawage, the Mohawk community, which I referenced, and they are constantly going back and forth all the time. A very good book to read is Unredeemed Captive. It's about the Deerfield massacre, and about a captive who stays with the Mohawk and her ongoing relationship with her white family while remaining Mohawk. Okay, go ahead. One thing to point out is that we tend to think of the native people as being, you know, from an earlier stage in history, or less developed. And certainly they retained practices that were much more ancient than the settlers. But they were actually much more cosmopolitan at this point than your average settler. They probably spoke multiple languages, so they spoke whatever their tribal language was, Mohawk or Abenaki. They probably spoke other indigenous languages. They almost definitely spoke French, and they probably spoke English as well. And they're constantly negotiating multiple cultural and political bodies in order to survive. This was a community that was made up of 20 plus tribal groups, right? Because this is a constant influx of refugees, people moving north across the border, captives that are taken in. At times you have captive leaders, the great white chief of the Abenaki. Nice little interesting rabbit trail if you want to follow that. And it's a place in where native peoples are very actively, intentionally engaging European culture. Go to the next one. On an international level, so Abenaki up there were Catholic, and part of that was that this is a wampum belt, which is an incredibly important ceremonial object that took years and years to make, that you would give to neighboring tribes in order to establish relationships. This is the one they sent to France to memorialize their relationship with the French people. Go ahead. So whoever this Indian was, and this is an example of their dress to give you an idea of what this hybrid culture looked like. So it incorporates both traditional native styles and European dress as well. This is a Mohawk chief. I didn't have a good example for Abenaki or someone from Ganawage. This was a New York reservation. Go ahead. And this is a map of central Vermont. It's not very good. You're not going to get all the details, but here's Berlin Pond. And all these lines here are trails, native trails, that people, when they showed up, recognized. So again, it's not as if we're just following the Winooski River up and down to get elsewhere. These are tribes that went, trails that go all through central Vermont that were in relatively constant use. And most of our roads, the important roads, were built on.
They travel with horses or walking or what?
Walking, of course, up until Europeans, but even afterwards, it was mostly still walking.
Okay.
Horses, from what I can tell, never became that important. Because a lot of the water was, you used canoes when you could.
What's the source of your map?
Right.
This is from a Berlin history.
9.
Yes.
Oh, who was the region? 9 from Berlin. Probably.
I can track that down later and send it to you. All right, go ahead. Okay, this is the stuff you all should know, and if you don't, you're gonna learn it quick, because you're buying those copies of Across the Onion, and you're gonna go find them yourself. So you get the Gazetteer, and it says all these different locations, and you look at Across the Onion, it says, that's 275 Snow Hill Road on the left side. Or, that's where so-and-so used to live. So this is the details of the presence. Kitchen middens are these giant piles of shells. There used to be a huge freshwater oyster population in the Winooski. Mussels, yeah. The biggest Indian village was at the confluence of the Kingsbury and Winooski. I have a picture of that I'll show you. There's 12 fireplaces. There's cornfields the writers estimate to have been cultivated 35 years before settlement in 1790s. So active cultivation, that would have been at the time of the French and Indian War, up until that time, which would make sense that people could still actively cultivate up until that point. So 1760 about. And this is the fortification I talked about, the confluence of the Sarampon Brook and the Winooski, which is just right over here. You can probably see it from here. Go ahead.
And did you want to say anything about the last line?
Oh, just they list stuff that they find, like axes, the pots they find, and all kinds of things. I don't know, the cannonball did confuse me a bit because, but other than it showed that they were engaged in more sophisticated military activity than you often think. Okay, go ahead. And that's a picture of Kingsbury comes in from here, I think is where the perspective is, and village would have been right there.
Kingsbury is down Route 14.
Is that,
I believe so.
Yes,
14,
yeah.
yeah.
Is that the Cape Farm Bridge?
Yes, Cape Farm Bridge, right across from the cemetery up here, if I'm
Cape
remembering where I took the picture from.
Yeah.
No, go ahead. Oh, just, so back to this real quick. Why East Montpelier? It's the same reason why Montpelier gets flooded. It's much generally flatter here, and it doesn't lend itself to such extreme flooding. Like when you look at the old histories, they say, yeah, we tried to settle up top. You can see the evidence of catastrophic floods shortly before we arrived, but everyone just wanted to live down by the river. Well, people lived here because it's generally flatter land to cultivate and less risk of a flood.
Not now.
Just an example of an Abenaki person who was around at this time, Indian Joe. You are familiar with his story? Go ahead. So he was actually, I think, originally Mi'kmaq, but he was adopted by the Abenaki. He was very prominent in Vermont, in Newbury as well. There's all these stories about he and his wife. And this is a story of a settler, 1789, right around Jacob Fowler, who shows up and almost starves to death and was saved by Indian Joe when he traded his shirt, the settler, for a moose that Indian Joe had hunted. And that's Walcott, so not too far from here. Go ahead.
is Joe's Pond named after this?
Yes. It marries,
And Molly.
Molly Pond, yes. Molly, in Abenaki you don't say the R, and so Mary becomes Molly. M-A-L-I. And so English speakers say, oh, they're saying Molly, M-O-L-L-Y. But those two, that's for Joe and his wife Mary, Molly. This is a very interesting snapshot. Okay, so the question is, if there's one Indian, what is that Indian doing? And if there's one, are there more? Now, generally speaking, the question is always answered yes, because Native people never are alone unless you are exiled. That's the worst punishment you could have. Like, we have this ideal of the mountain person who goes off by themselves and conquers the wilderness and survives on their own two hands. In a Native context, they would say, you are on a suicide mission. It takes a whole community to survive off the land. And when you don't have jails, and you don't have any other kinds of dealing with people who are troubled, what you do is you exile them from the community, which is saying, good luck, buddy, you're not gonna last. So it's almost certain that this person who died, if they were there, was not alone. And the reason why this makes it more plausible that there was a community in this area is because in Danville, not too far away, there was a historic community that returned to their historic lands during, even after when this murder would have occurred. So this is 1800. I don't know what the present Bacon House is. I should figure that out. A tribe of peaceful Indians inhabited the hilltop, and they would come back every year, and they would spend time there, hunt and fish, and they borrowed a pot from the settler family, and they would always return it, and the pot would be polished like new, and it would be filled with either venison or fish. So this is after when the murder occurred. A group of people living in their coming back to their ancestral territory. Go ahead. All right, my current best theory. So, to sum up that last section, it's very plausible. In fact, likely there would have been a group of people in this area, general central Vermont area, that continue to come back here to some degree, even if that's just a hunt for a short period of time. And it's quite plausible that there would have been somebody for Jacob to have this interaction with. Go ahead. This is where D.P. Thompson comes in. And I think his fiction, his historical fiction, gives a really interesting, promising, tantalizing, I think, actually hidden story about what happened. So he wrote the official history, the most important official history of central Vermont and of Montpelier. He interviewed all the people that were still around. He came here in 1804. He was born in Charlestown, Mass, but came here as a young boy. And if you go down to Route 2 near Cody Chevrolet, there's that old brick house. Usually, I think it's a spa right now of some kind. And there's a historical marker. Are you responsible for that historical marker? No.
Sorry, can't claim any credit.
Okay, but that's where he lived. And he wrote, along with his histories, a number of works of fiction that were mostly historical fiction, like 10 books. And he would take stories that he heard from these old timers and put them into work. So that story I told you about Fowler, the bear, and the mountain lion appears in his novel Gout Burley, which is about a murder that happens, a trapper, he's in the Maine woods, and he kills an Indian, and a lot of parallels to this story. Go ahead to the next slide. This is a compilation of shorter stories. There's only like 4 or 5, The Shaker Lovers and Other Tales. And in his introduction he says, of all my historical works that are very much based on real things, this is the realest of the real. These are all true stories on some level, but illustrations of the actual incidents. Go ahead. And so I came to the story, An Indian's Revenge. Now, before I get to the story, why don't we know more about D.P. Thompson? Or why isn't he, like, present? Like, I never see.
It is.
Where?
The historians. We all have them, the people that research around here.
Why isn't there something at the Eldridge Public Library? I mean, he was internationally known as a writer when he was alive.
That I didn't know.
Yeah. He lived on Berry Street. I couldn't find where it
I've
was.
seen this.
Anyway, so this is a short story. It's very short. It's like 5-6 pages long. And can you go to the next slide? I don't know if I have notes about it. Okay, go back to where I was. I just listened to it again today, and it's almost exactly like Jacob Fowler's story. It starts with the narrator showing up at this settler's house on the river with his wife. That's something I couldn't talk about. He had this wife that he had brought from Corinth, that he had stolen from, so the story goes, from one of his rivals, who ended up traipsing off into the wilderness and ending up dead.
Do you remember her name?
I think it's Rebecca. I'm not positive. But it was where D.B. Thompson ended up living, in Jacob Fowler's territory. So I wonder if there's another sort of shady thing going on there. Anyway, he's visiting this settler who comes running into the house, slams the door, and he says, I don't know how they found me, but they found me. They're back again. There's 3 Indians out there, and they're still hunting me. So the wife, I think, is the one who ends up telling the story, but she tells this long, convoluted story how he was out hunting, and he comes across this Indian who had been accidentally shot by his companions, his Indian companions, and he nurses him back to health. And then they became buddies, and they would give gifts to each other, and this Indian was always devoted to him for saving him. Well, one night when this hunter was out, this is allegedly occurred at Lake Magog, he heard the sound of a mountain lion. So he gets his gun out, it sounds like it's about ready to pounce, so he didn't know what to do, so he shot. And then he heard a human cry. It was his friend was behind the mountain lion. He was going to kill the mountain lion, but this settler shot the Indian, who was mortally wounded. He rushed up to him to see if he could save him, but then the Indian looks up, and he's full of rage, and he sees it's his friend, and he says, "Oh." He didn't say anything, but he could see in his look that he had forgiven him because it was a mistake. There was no blame there. But his friends, who he knew were around, his friends who had never trusted him, were sure to find out that he had killed this Indian. So he takes the body and he dumps it in the lake. Well, his friends show up, and they follow he's watching them. I'm not sure how he's going to do it, but he's watching them track his trail to the lake, looking at every leaf that had been broken and every print in the sand. And they let out this howl that, yes, our friend has been killed. And so Jacob takes off. Well, that's not Jacob, it's an unknown person, takes off into the wilderness with his dog. So he manages to escape. Some sort of incredible details of that. He comes back, and the friend who is visiting, we'll call him Jacob, the one who had murdered his friend. Sorry, I'm using a lot of friends in unspecific language. The person visiting the cabin who has heard this story for the first time says, how is this possible? There are no more Indian wars. This country has been tamed. They are not going to do anything. And he says, you don't understand, Native people. Justice requires payback. And the implication is that there's no justice in this system for this situation. They will find me as long as I'm alive. So he runs off, he solves a problem by running off, escaping into the woods and hiding out for the next few days. The story ends with the same person coming back to where the cabin was and it now being abandoned. And the murderer and his wife had relocated out west. And that was the end of the story. So, broadly parallel to the story that we've been digging up about Jacob. So, but there's a lot of questions that this raises. My conclusions, I think this did happen. I think this was accurate. There's just too much smoke. there was an Abenaki or Mohawk person and a band in the area, I think. I think we can ask the question, was this murder? There are scenarios in which there could be an altercation that's not some sort of premeditated or even manslaughter on the part of Jacob Fowler. I tend to think that his character shows that he is willing to, he's not afraid of murder, but we don't know the exact situation. I have to ask for my own research, were there more than two Fowlers that I'm kind of confusing? Like, you think of the Fowler and Johnson, is it the same one? Maybe he did end up out west or in Canada, as the story says. I don't think there are two, but how is he able to disappear in plain sight? I think is a very fair question. And the next slide, I think this is, the last question is the most, okay, go back, I just don't have a slide for it. The biggest question for me is, why would D.P. Thompson, if he's masking that story, wouldn't put that in his history? I think on the one hand you could say, D.P. Thompson interviewed everyone, he's our best historian, he's got all of these details in his actual history. If it happened and he thought so, he would have put it in there. On the other hand, there's good reasons why somebody may not want to put that in there. Can you think of any?
Well, it wouldn't be a lawsuit.
Well, to protect the next generations, if they stayed around.
So the Fowlers themselves?
Yeah.
Well, but there's also the question, from who? Who are they, what do they need protecting from? I mean, at the time, they might even be considered heroic, or there wouldn't be this attitude that we have today of like, this was a very negative history and like violence and all of that. But maybe there's a sense to protect the community, that the community's origin doesn't have the kind of violence that maybe other places did. I don't know.
And you don't know if Jacob Fowler did other really nasty things.
Well, we do know nasty-ish.
Right.
Not as, we don't know he did anything that nasty. But all these different places, nastiness sort of, you just get that smell. At least that's my impression as somebody thinking of this. I would say that it's just not clear. And as like somebody who works in an Indigenous community, they would point to this and say, this is the problem you've always had, and you still have, is that we're very conflicted about how we tell the story. Because on the one hand, so D.P. Thompson, I should have said, one of his most important books was about the King's Philip War, right? And he very sympathetically told the story of, this is early New England history, the southern tribes fighting against the colonies. And very tragic. And he championed the native voice. And so if he did willingly not tell the story fully, it's one of those things I think a lot of us are very good at. It doesn't mean, whether you're native, non-native, whoever you are. We can get really strong in our soapboxes about stuff that's happening over there, right? And I think in Vermont, boy, we've been abolitionists and proud of it because it's not something we've had to deal with as directly as other people. But when it comes to telling the story of our community, maybe D.P. Thompson still, it was too uncomfortable. It wasn't something you want. If you can kind of hold it back, maybe it's just best for the next generations that you do so. Maybe. The other possibility is that this was invented by Jacob Fowler to serve his interests. Now, you can think about this. If there's a lot of anti-native sentiment, or if you just want people to stay away from you, leave you alone. So if you killed somebody who wronged you justifiably, boy, that certainly does make you look tough. Now, Jacob Fowler was always somebody who was not legitimate in his society for very different reasons.
Tory.
Being a Tory, and maybe just not being the person who was very good at living within systems. He's always somebody who's on the frontier where there's a lot more fluidity, there's less oversight, and he always kept moving. So that's where I am. I'm curious if you have any thoughts or any suggestions where I can look.
Did you say he was married and had children?
Yes.
And is there any record of what happened to them?
So the daughter who I think he followed, if that's accurate, they ended up out west. It seems as if his direct line did not survive in central Vermont, from what I can tell. Though there is a Fowler Road in Plainfield, going the wrong direction, Marshfield, Plainfield line. And so I don't know, maybe,
Power septic.
Calais too has Fowler Road.
Yeah.
Calais has a Fowler Road.
but there was a different Fowler line that ended up in Northfield. I mean, they were all over the place. So I don't know who's who, and maybe you all would have a better sense of that.
There's an 1865 article in one of the papers that I think misstated his story as Abner Fowler. Have you seen that?
I have
one?
seen that, yes.
And I think Corinne Cooper thinks that, there's a Fowler connection to Jacob in Montpelier, or that there is a Fowler in the 1858 map of Montpelier, there's a Fowler on Summer Street.
Okay, and she thinks that's a direct.
Well, and we were talking about it on the Facebook, Montpelier, Vermont History, 3 years ago. I just looked it up.
Okay.
But does Abner ring a bell to you? Because
Abner
now I'm
is-
trying to figure out what
Yeah.
about this Northfield family? And maybe I'm confused about, because there's Northfield family too.
It's not fresh enough for me to remember those details.
Because there's
Yeah.
4 generations of Jacobs, and then there's like 3 or 4 generations of Abners, and they are related.
Mhm.
And there's an Abner that could have lived on Summer Street in one of the later generations. So,
Okay.
I don't know.
Summer Street in Montpelier, okay, and I live in Winter Street, so it's right next door.
Jennifer has a picture for you to look at.
Yes, I
Okay.
do.
Anyone else?
I have a question. When you say they went out west, I'm a little confused about what period that would be. Would that be with the railroads? Would that be after the Civil War, when the Ohio River Valley
No,
was?
if the story's accurate, that would have been before the War of 1812. That would have
Before
been
1812.
maybe even before 1800s. So he sold his land in 1793. So it could be any time after that.
So Lewis and Clark type stuff. Right?
I
Well,
think
that
there was a very active, I've done some research about New York State, and the highway and the Mohawk, and the canal,
yeah.
and the Mohawk River, that was the path for hundreds of years before, and they just kept on, and headed towards Ohio, and, that was how everybody got out west, which was the Midwest at that point.
Right.
But I think it was always like a superhighway in its
Yeah.
time.
Now, this would not have been uncommon. I mean, I guess it would have been the next generation really, but the exodus from Vermont and a lot of northern New England, right, when the land starts to get played out and there's more opportunities in the west, you had a lot of people moving west.
Yeah, I got a question. I'm kind of curious as to what the state of the judicial system was at this time, and I ask that question because, I grew up in Kentucky, and I know for a fact that quite a number of my relatives and other people used to just kind of go directly to the cause of their disturbance. They used to just sort of shoot each other. A couple of my cousins were shot in broad daylight back in around the early 1800s. I'm wondering whether murder at that time whether we're looking at it from a lens of modern judiciary processes that maybe they didn't then. And, I mean, was there even a circuit court up here at the time, and is it unusual that people would take the law in their own
Yeah.
hands? That certainly was usual in Kentucky.
I think here there would have been a stronger sense of the possibility of a judicial system, and there would have been more people who were invested in that idea, but the reality was very limited. And there was a similar story. I gave a talk in Franklin, New Hampshire, actually, and in the area there was a very similar case where there was a couple natives who were killed by settlers, but that people recognized it and grabbed them, and there was pressure from tribal members to have them prosecuted. This would have been roughly at the same time. A huge mob from further south, like a couple towns south, came and actively made sure that that trial was not gonna go forward, and got the people released. So even if there were judicial systems, you know, the public pressure, they couldn't withstand the same level of public, well, can they today? I don't know, but, yes, you'd have something very different than what we assume.
Another thing I was wondering, I recently read a biography of Samuel Adams, and I'm not a historian, but I gotta say I was a little shocked by the violence against Tory people. And I know, and also, just as an observation of my own family, since I've been living up here, we go back and forth in Canada. We go back and forth, live in Canada, live in Quebec, live down here. And I think for people up here, at least in northern Vermont, in my experience, a lot of people I know, they're intermarried a lot, and it's not, the idea of going back and forth between Canada, especially if you're a Tory, is not that unusual.
Yeah, and another thing I should add, to supplement that with the Indigenous context, go to the next slide. This is interesting, I don't know if she's still doing this, but she looks into cemeteries, like very detailed looks at Vermont cemeteries. And she was an archaeologist, and she said, you know what, you have to realize that Jacob Fowler and whoever this person he had this interaction with, they almost certainly would have known each other, or known of each other. That this was an incredibly small, well-connected world,
Sure.
that
Yes, that's right.
all these combatants, for most of the time, are interacting at trading posts and various parts of the colonial society, constantly going back and forth. We're used to this idea that, okay, you have the Indians over on this side, and you have the settlers over here, and the only time they see each other is when they're on the battlefield or sneaking around attacking their homes, and that's not the case.
On that subject, you know, I mean, this is more about Kentucky, but one of my great grannies was scalped by Indians, and, you know, she wore a little thing on her head for the rest of her life, because she managed to live, but there was a famous kidnapping of Daniel Boone's daughters down there near Boonesboro, and all the people that were in that situation, the abductors and the they all, like you say, they all knew each other perfectly well. They were very familiar with each other.
I don't know about here, but my father's family, some of them were Tories, and they definitely left town in a big hurry after.
It's very common, and you know, it's important to kind of complicate that. I think you're bringing that up. You know, we just are given this narrative like if you were a Tory, you were just an absolute sellout, and you were only in it for yourself. I mean, this is an open question. Where is this gonna go? What's the best answer? Who's the best governing, what's the best governing situation that we should have? And a lot of smart, normal people said, you know what, I think we should stick with what we've known, right? It wasn't this sort of like, well, I got a ton to gain by this. And we often read that into history. All right, last question for me. Anything about East Montpelier that I should know that maybe you think I have missed?
Well, I wanna ask, where's Polly? Polly, didn't we get some arrowheads from David that were found along the, like near the Cape Farm, near Coburn Bridge?
That sounds familiar, but I have no idea where they are.
Well, we may have them now, or
They may be at the town clerk's office.
yeah, it's possible, so, again, I think whatever, there was something found along the river, or along the Winooski near Cape Farm.
Yeah, Samuel, I think, the town was, widening the road just before you get to the Cape Farm Bridge. And when, I think some state engineers were there because of the historical significance of that area. And they found the flint, shavings from making the arrowheads. And
Church, is that what they call that?
the church, or
Yeah.
whatever the rock was that crashed upon the other rock to make it. And I think one of us asked the historical folks about, how old do you think they are? And they said, well, they couldn't tell, but they were either 200 years old, or they could have been 5,000 years old. Because, and they were serious, because the technology of the folks who were living there hadn't changed from when, the first native folks were living in that area. So they could have been as recent as 1790s, or they could have been, even, 1400s, 1500s.
Yeah,
But
so
I
there
think
are
those-
three
Yeah.
small rock
Okay.
artifacts that I think Dave, Polly's husband, brought to our attention, and he had been a road engineer, right? A civil engineer, Dave.
No, he wasn't
Oh,
an engineer.
oh, okay, sorry.
Just history, he was just interested in history stuff.
Right. So those are probably somewhere not far away from here, given that the town clerk's office is for.
Sounds like you have a new project.
Yeah, but anyway, I mean, that's a little bit to add to the verification of the site or the general area.
I think these chips were found maybe 15 years ago.
Okay.
Yeah.
One thing that, this area, a lot of areas like this, but, there was a lot of things that were found relatively early on, and then sites have been significantly modified or washed away with what dumped in the river and things like that, so.
But at least now, the state knows to have archaeological
Yes.
site checks before things get dug up or, plowed over or whatever. Plowed over, plowed under.
I suppose that's how Flint Wiswell got his name.
Richard Wiswell, who owns Cape Farm, his son's name is Flint.
Very, very, very last thing, and then I'll say goodnight. Back to the story, and if you ever find anything, let me know. I can only find really one source for it. And that's one reason I think, well, this could be an invention of some kind.
You mean D.P. Thompson's story?
Not the historical fiction, but the actual Fowler story
Okay.
of this incident. It's cited in the Gazetteer as if it's referring back to something, another source, and I think Charles Heath is somebody, a lawyer from Plainfield, or at least he ended up in Plainfield, who did a lot of research on this, but his papers, I don't know where they are. And so the Gazetteer refers to a source we don't have. And I don't know of any other independent sources that tell this story, which is a clue that it could be less of a historical event and more of an invention. So as I leave you, I tell you, I can come back in 5 years and say, you know what, I don't think this really happened. Or a lot of this all happened, but that story was invented more by Fowler or somebody else to do work and not tell the story. Or I can come back and say, I found the smoking gun, this is it did happen. So if any clues that you find, let me know. Thank you very much.